Hello, this is Tiffany Culver from Schreiner University. This particular study looks at undergraduate but upper level psychology students and their knowledge of empirical peer-reviewed journal articles. So we know as faculty that reading empirical articles can be a bit tedious, but we have quite a bit of information and knowledge about how to go about reading those particular articles. So I was fascinated by this question as to whether or not my upper level psychology students understood peer-reviewed empirical articles and what they were, and then also whether or not they knew how to examine them and look at their strengths and weaknesses. So this was basically a study that contained a smaller number of participants, unfortunately, 21, used in an upper level psychology course. And I did a pre-test, post-test design. So interestingly enough, I did two pre-test um, types and two post-test. The first one was a general knowledge pretest, which consisted of 10 multiple choice questions. Most of the questions in that were just general filler questions. So I didn't really want my students to know what I was asking them about. So I threw a lot of questions about just general psychology experiments or experiments that they'd heard of before, in addition to questions about what peer-reviewed meant and what empirical meant, etc. So with that particular pretest, the highest score you could get is a 10. And my students scored a 6.50 on that. Okay. The other pretest was an application pretest with an article. So with this particular pretest, they were given an empirical article that was actually peer reviewed and a set of questions asking them whether or not they knew it was a empirical article and why or how, and also whether or not it was a peer-reviewed article. It also asked them to look at the setup and the headings and know how to understand how a peer-reviewed empirical article would be set up. They also were asked to look at some of the strengths and limitations. So with that particular pretest, they made a 6.75 average on that. So that's when the training started. Unfortunately, the training was not as long as I wanted. We only had 7 sessions. The first one, I believe, is one of the most important, though, and that's granting your psychology students permission to evaluate the reading, whether or not it be a textbook or empirical article or a commentary. A lot of times students believe that they don't have the right or they don't have the knowledge to be evaluating or questioning the text or questioning the article. And so I build them up and let them know, hey, you have this knowledge, you have been in other psychology classes, you can come up with ways to maybe improve in this empirical article. Let them know that experiments, there are none that are perfect, and there's always room for growth. And so I grant them permission to question those things. The next thing is we take it slow. We look at the title and the abstract of the article. Again, this is something that we all do, right? When we're handed an empirical article, it's typically for a purpose. And I teach my students about that purpose and how you go to certain headings to look for that information. You don't have to start reading the first word of that article all the way to the end to figure out if I even need this article. We quickly go to the page that we need because we know the headings and the way that it's set up and structured. We get the information or we don't. If we get it, we keep it, and if we don't, we discard it. The next one is, again, looking at those headings. We want them to see that pattern that we all see, that introduction, the lit review, the methodology with the participants and the instruments, etc. I want them to see that that's a pattern, that's a trend in your empirical articles. I also want them to think about whether or not their initial questions about the article were answered. So when they begin to look at the title and the abstract, I'm hoping that they are starting to think about what they know about that topic, trying to pull some of that prior information out of long-term memory and use that information to help answer or come up with a purpose for their reading. The next part is evaluating the results in the discussion of the article. I ask them to think about whether or not their initial questions were answered. What other questions do they have now? What would they ask the author? Evaluating the possible bias. Let's question the methodology. Perhaps maybe a survey shouldn't have been done, or perhaps maybe in addition to a survey, an interview should be done. And we can brainstorm about how that might add to the data. We can brainstorm about whether or not the number of participants was low or high, etc., and whether or not it included the demographics that we would want to include in order to generalize the results. And then 6, I want them to pretend the author's in front of them and think about, what would you ask this author? What other questions do we want to know? And then finally, practice, practice, practice. We have done this forever, and so we have tons of practice. And I'm sure that you've experienced this. I know I have. But when I'm given an article from a student and they ask me, will this work for my research project? I can quickly flip to the section I need to, and then within a minute or two say yes, and I hand it back. And they're looking at me like, how do you know? And I want to teach them, hey, that's what you can do. When you go into it with a purpose and you know how it's set up, you can determine quickly if you need to evaluate that article and read it from the first word to the last. In terms of the efficacy of my intervention, the post-test scores for the general knowledge multiple choice test did show a statistically significant difference. We improved from a 6.50 all the way to a 7.75. That was great. Unfortunately, the application test did not show a statistically significant difference. In fact, it declined, it decreased. We went from 6.75 to 6.41. I also asked the student whether or not they enjoyed it, the training, they felt it was worthwhile, and I had all of the students strongly agree that it was worthwhile. In terms of my results and my discussion, I think what this study, what we can infer from this study is the fact that we need to expose our students more to empirical articles. We need to spend time explaining this to them. Sometimes I think it's common knowledge to us and we forget that they don't know that information. And they also don't understand the importance of that information and how research is something that they probably will use in their career, whether or not they're a researcher or a practitioner.